Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live stream Q&A for Never Rarely, Sometimes Always. A big thanks to everyone at Focus Features for working with us on this event. My name is Jesse Trussell. I'm a repertory and specialty film programmer at BAM in Brooklyn. With us tonight, we have writer-director Eliza Hittman. We'll be talking for a little while at first and then opening things up to audience questions. So feel free to start leaving those in the YouTube chat now, and we promise to get to as many as we can. Eliza, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for doing this. It's nice to be able to have these sort of virtual events during this kind of very crazy time.
Yeah.
I think to start things off, why don't we just talk about sort of the impetus of this project for you, how you began developing the script, and kind of where this all began.
I first started thinking about this project a long time ago. Turn this off. In 2012, I read a newspaper article about the death of Savita Halappanavar in Ireland, a dentist who passed away after being denied a life-saving abortion. And I was really sad, and I just began to read about the history of abortion in Ireland and the journey that a lot of women would take from Ireland across the Irish Sea to London for an abortion and back in one day. And there was something about that journey that was really compelling to me. And I thought about it, like a hero's journey, which they talk a lot about in screenwriting. Except it's this journey that nobody would ever speak about. It's such an untold journey that's shrouded in shame and secrecy, because obviously what they're doing is so taboo. And I just started thinking about like what the equivalent narrative to that would be in the United States, and started thinking about the journey that women take from rural areas when they can't get access to urban areas, and began to do a lot of reading and research.
And sort of as you were thinking about the script, did you always know you wanted to have this sort of focus that was very primarily on that journey, or did you think about that maybe being one act of a larger story? How did you come to that kind of brilliantly like controlled focus?
I always saw that, structure of, this hero's journey, of leaving one place, traveling to another, getting the abortion, and, the beginning of the journey home. I always had that sort of structure in my mind, but one thing that I knew I wanted to explore, in addition to the physical journey and the obstacles of the journey, were the obstacles that real women encounter in trying to get abortions. So I guess it's, sort of a story about a woman who encounters, a young woman who encounters sort of micro obstacles of just how hard it is to take this trip, and in addition to these kind of bureaucratic obstacles and emotional obstacles. And yeah, that was sort of the concept.
And I think, I mean, it comes across so well in the film. You use the metaphor of the hero's journey, and it does. Every sort of action within the film has this magnification to it, and the entire atmosphere of it feels so pressured, almost like though she's being surveilled, even though she isn't. Could you talk a little bit about that tone and atmosphere in the film, which is you feel the heaviness of it?
I guess I was thinking about, in this kind of classical structure of a hero's journey, there's usually an antagonist. But in this film, I knew there wouldn't be one. And I was just trying to explore ways in which, the men around this young woman could create, an antagonistic tension throughout the narrative. So in lieu of one, sort of male antagonist that's standing in the way of her getting an abortion, I was thinking about the ways in which women encounter, ambient, everyday sexism and misogyny and hostility, and learn to navigate it.
Right. And the misogynist system of America is in many ways the antagonist of the film. I think it was hard, I mean, certainly for me thinking about this film right now, to not think about Texas and Alabama and Tennessee, these states that are effectively trying to outlaw abortion as a pretext within this pandemic.
Mhm.
Um, I was just wondering if you could think a little bit or talk a little bit more about that, like the idea of the way that this system keeps replicating itself,
Mhm.
on young women across time and
Yeah,
space, from Ireland here.
we've been entrenched in the same battle for over 30 years. And, it's unfortunate that we're, in the middle of, this incredibly tragic pandemic, and we have politicians who are playing a very dangerous game, with women's access to reproductive care. Um, and trying to deem it non-essential. I was reading an article today that said something about the fact that they decided to permit like wrestling to happen. And it's like, wait, why is wrestling essential, but women's reproductive health isn't? And I don't know, I'm happy the film is screening on VOD and that people can watch it, because I think there's a lot of vulnerable people in this country, like the character in the film.
I think one of the really remarkable things about the film is the cast in general, and especially Sydney in the lead.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about finding her, how she came to the project, and maybe then also casting in general?
Yeah, I think my approach to casting is always to cast a very wide net. So it wasn't like I had like one really specific thing in mind when I started, or person in mind. I really wanted to see as much young talent as I could. And I think that I learn a lot about the character from seeing interpretations of it and seeing it read, 100 times. Um, in sort of watching all of these auditions from the beginning, I learned a lot about what didn't work. It didn't work for me if she was too young and felt too innocent and too much like a victim. And I knew that we needed to find somebody who, had sort of a depth and a story inside them that resonated and was palpable on screen, but also wasn't too injured, wasn't too weak, because we needed to believe she could take this journey and had this fight in her, essentially. Um, and it's a very random story, but I produced a movie in like 2013 called Buffalo Juggalos, and I met Sydney on the fringes of this other shoot. And she was only 13 or 14, and we just kind of randomly added her on Facebook, but we kept tracking her because she's a musician, and she would post all these videos of herself just alone in her bedroom playing kind of angry covers of punk songs. And I was really, taken by her screen presence from these Facebook videos. And at a certain point in our casting process, I said to my producers, the character is kind of like this girl that I once met in Buffalo. And then finally, I was like, we have to just bring this girl down from Buffalo to audition. Um, and, I knew as soon as she walked in the door, that I wanted to cast her. And we had Skyped about it, and we began a relationship before she came to New York to actually audition. But once she was here, I wanted to cast her.
You work with a lot of either non-professional performers or performers in other genres, or sort of like not as experienced performers. And you have this theater background. You were trained in the theater. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own ideas of working with actors on set, especially within these really interesting kind of like new performers frequently for us as viewers when we see them in your films.
Well, I think first of all, I inherently cast people that I trust can do it. And, Cindy had never acted before, but she performs all the time. She performs like every other night in Buffalo, in basements and in coffee shops. So I knew that there was this like fundamental desire to perform. And I don't think I could have cast like a person who didn't have that thing in them. And, she, it wasn't like a necessarily a fair process to her. She didn't get a week of rehearsal. She had like a day or two. And
that is remarkable considering the performance she gives in the
her
film.
first day really acting was the first day of the set, or of our shoot, and she was nervous and I was nervous and everybody, producers were nervous and financiers were nervous, and there's dailies that come out and everybody's watching, is she going to be able to carry this movie? And I think, because there was such a short rehearsal period and the shoot is, really intense, I tried to structure things in a way in the schedule that gave her the ability to warm up, if that makes sense. So like the first, half day that we were shooting, we just did like walking shots around, rural Pennsylvania. And I just tried to look at ways in which I could give her time, to get confident. And, she had a remarkable ability to be very sincere and earnest and grounded. And I think sometimes, like while we were working together, I would give a lot of direction just off screen while we were rolling in takes, and we found a way to just kind of shoot, and I would come up with ideas as we were rolling. And, without a rehearsal, it seems like that was sort of our, way of
finding it on the day a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, there's some of these scenes in the film are so extraordinarily intense for a young performer in her first sort of acting role. Could you talk about specifically in these really high emotion scenes, like how do you handle a set in those moments? Sort of what's that environment like?
Well, I think, I gravitate to working with a really small crew. And, for the, really pivotal scenes, emotional scenes of the film, I always try and scale back, the number of people who are with us. And I think that, kind of like creating this kind of intimacy around the performance and a safe space around the actors is really important to what I do.
We'll be opening up to questions from the audience in a few minutes. So if you have any of those, make sure you stick them in the YouTube chat. But back to Eliza for now. I'm really interested in the way teenagedom as it's depicted sort of like popularly is very different than the way that teenagedom is depicted in your work. And your work strikes me as much more sort of reminiscent of my own teenage life and others that I've known. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, of what you think, sort of what really attracts you to that age range for some of the stories you've told so far. And also, why you think perhaps that your structure or way of looking at that time of life is maybe a little different than the sort of mainstream depiction.
I'm done making movies about teenagers.
This last one.
Yeah, this was it. I think that there's a lot of reasons. I think that for me, I always think about my films as being outtakes from conventional movies about teenagers and these kind of solitary, painful times in our lives, that are where we're so vulnerable, and they really shape who we are and how we see the world. And I guess I think that like a conventional coming of age movie really, focuses on like this sort of transformation, whereas I think about coming of age as like this experience of, becoming disillusioned. And yeah, I think that, I just try and, show these kind of honest, painful experience, that hopefully, speaks to an audience and that they, can connect to it. And I think that the themes and the emotions of the characters are universal and not necessarily specific to the age.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. We have our first question from the audience. Can you talk about your decision to shoot on film for this project?
Mm-hmm. I love shooting on film, and I've fought for film on most of my projects except It Felt Like Love, which was micro budget. Um, I think for me, because I shoot so close up and so intimately, I just prefer the way that film captures skin, the face, emotions, bodies. And because that's really the kind of focus of everything I do, I feel that we achieve something that's more human.
Mhm.
And that's first and foremost the reason. And I think also because I'm sort of talking about marginalized communities that are so stagnant and stuck in time, shooting on film also evokes this sort of timelessness.
Mhm. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your working relationship with Helen Levar, who is one of the great working cinematographers, and your films with her look so gorgeous. How do you sort of work with her on set? Sort of what's that process like for you?
Helen has this beautiful quote that I think she once said, like in a filmmaker magazine, about our process. And I think it's, true in a lot of ways. She said that when you prepare a movie, when you're in prep, you share a dream with the director. And when you're on a set, you don't dream anymore.
Interesting.
And I think that that's really true. I think that, when we sit down and we talk about, the film and we go through the script page by page, it's all about getting inside my head and the world and the characters. And, we do like a general shot list, and we spend as much time as we can in the locations. And I think Helen knows that I have a subjective approach to shooting, and she knows, the lenses that I gravitate to, and, sort of the moments that I'm trying to punctuate with slow motion. And we have like a shorthand at this point, but we don't try to sort of replicate what we did before in a way, because we have to sort of open up this new story. And when we're on set, we just work and it's intuitive, and the shot list and all the work that we did in prep is mostly in our minds and our bodies, and we work.
The next question is from Irena. I like how your story develops very quickly without an overlong exposition. Had you written the script that way, or did you come to that decision in editing?
That it was always like that. It always started at a talent show, and we sort of, understand from that talent show the world in which the character lives, the town, the type of kids, the hostility, and then yeah, there were, a few small scenes that fell away, but it's pretty close to what was on the page.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I love, and especially in those early sections, there's a real sort of tactility to the way you shoot the town. You can sort of feel the feelings of doing the piercing or something like that. I mean, could you talk about that sort of like your films feel like very sort of large sensory expressions within the kind of like controlled observational style?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's just all about aligning the audience with what the character is going through. Um, the nose piercing scene in particular was sort of a beautiful accident in a way. Originally in the script, she was dyeing her hair. And for me, it was a moment, of trying to sort of express how the character reacts to being pregnant, and find something that's behavioral versus dialogue driven. And originally she dyed her hair because I was like, oh, I was looking for a physical act that showed she was trying to control something about her body. But right before Sydney came to New York to shoot the film, she was playing like with her band, and she like cut off her ponytail on stage. So she arrived in New York with this like, chopped off hair, and we couldn't dye it because it was just like this awkward length, and we couldn't add extensions, and her nose was pierced, and we got the idea to sort of shift from hair dyeing to nose piercing. But I don't know, I was just looking for, a small moment to communicate a lot of things. And for me, that moment communicates that she's trying to reclaim control over her body, but also, that she could inflict self-harm. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That answers your question, but just thinking and talking out loud about these small moments that, are used to express what the character is thinking and feeling.
I think, and it connects so beautifully to the idea of this sort of restricted time frame where you get so much from the characters from the way they interact with the world rather than big expository speeches or something like that.
Yeah, it's just trying to drop the audience into her world more than create all this drama around her home life and her circumstances.
The next question is from Rebecca. How did you approach your working relationship with and representation of Planned Parenthood? Did they advise you on that piece?
Yes. I consulted with Planned Parenthood. I went to Planned Parenthood in Pennsylvania, which was at the time called Keystone. I think they've rebranded themselves. I don't remember the name. And I talked a lot about parental consent laws and tried to understand, what they're up against. And we talked a lot about the process, of traveling or asking for a judge for permission. And they told me at that Planned Parenthood that, young women under 18 all the time go to Binghamton or New York, from where we were geographically. I got a lot of input. I think, there was a danger because I'm not making a documentary. And as an artist, I just began to take in so much information. But really, I tried to sort of stay focused, I would say, and sit with social workers and discuss the work that they do specifically with minors, because there's so many stories, in those facilities. And obviously, they're very sensitive to their representation. So I was just, trying to juggle a lot, I would say, in working with them. But they did read a script. They did give advice, but and I will say that like I discovered a lot of the film that I wanted to make and the story that I was telling in talking to social workers.
Is it correct? Is one of the Planned Parenthood workers you met plays one of the Planned Parenthood workers in the film?
Yeah, her name is Kelly Chapman, and actually she worked at another clinic, a private clinic called Choices in Queens, but she trained at Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger in Manhattan. I also felt like I needed an outside point of view other than Planned Parenthood, so I really just tried to meet with as many people as possible.
That section of the film where she's going to the different clinics, was that something that you had written before you sort of started all of your research? Did that change during the research process, or?
That I think was in the initial concept. And I'll just also say about Planned Parenthood, they were very generous and they allowed us to shoot in their real facilities. So I shot 2 Planned Parenthoods, one in Brooklyn and one in Manhattan. Yeah, I mean, they were really so generous with me and giving me access and tours and, answering all my questions. And in a way they were sounding boards, but, at the same time, it wasn't a documentary, and they understood that there was, that I was being selective and subjective about what was shown, because everything is through the character.
The next question from Ashley. This film is extremely atmospheric, and a lot of that comes from the locations and the location shooting. Could you talk about some of the locations you found and what it was like to shoot on the run?
We didn't shoot entirely run and gun. There's some subway stuff that's, stolen or, in a gray zone, with what you can do and can't do. Most of it is largely permitted. One of the bigger challenges was Port Authority because it's very expensive, and they only allow you to shoot there from 12 a.m. to 4 a.m. So that was like the biggest logistical challenge. I think, the atmospheric quality of the film really comes, from my exploration of the story as the writer. And I spend a lot of time in locations. So I, picked a town where I wanted the story set because I thought it was evocative to me. I took the bus ride the character takes to New York. I spent a lot of time, just trying to walk through the story as if I was the character. I think it's, I think the film is a big, in the edit there was a lot to balance between the procedural aspect of the story, the journey, the friendship, there's finding the balance between the narrative, the poetry, the atmosphere, that's always, I think, part of, the challenge of editing one of my films, is that they're not talking head films and they're aspiring at least to be something more poetic, I guess, like a poetic realism.
I will say, I think your films very much achieve that aspiration. They're stunning work, I think.
Thank you.
The next question is from Emily. The role of the father in the family is seemingly contentious, though he only appears a couple of times. What was your motivation behind that character and how he influences Autumn's story?
I, just like I said, I wanted to sort of have a slice of life film around what her home life is like. And I, didn't want to implicate one character as being the father of the baby, but I wanted to give you a sense that, all these male characters have sort of a hostile or entitled relationship with the protagonist. There's a few, small beats with him that, allude to the way that he treats women, and thinks about women and, as animals, and, just looking for sort of subtle ways to understand his role in that household, his relationship to her, and, let the audience use their imagination to, think about what his relationship to her is.
Got a few more minutes. If anyone have any last questions, throw those in the chat. Eliza, were there scenes left on the cutting room floor? Were there things that you worked on or had to lose at the last minute out of the film?
There's one scene in the trailer that ended up on the cutting room floor that a lot of people ask about. There's like a scene at the beach that I ended up cutting. And there was like a moment like, after the night with Jasper, where they kind of wake up on the subway and they're in the Rockaways. And they like see the beach from the train and they like go to the beach, and it just didn't work. It just felt like too far of a journey from the story in Manhattan. And even though it was pretty, and there were some nice moments to it, I felt it sort of lacked, sort of real purpose.
It's almost sort of breaks the spell of the very tight, controlled physical space they have to stay within.
It was a little too much of a diversion.
So I think we're just about out of time now, but I'd love to know, what are you working on next? So you were saying that this will be the end of your teenage trilogy.
My end of my teenage trilogy. I'm not so sure yet. I'm still thinking about what's next. I feel like I am still working on this movie in so many ways. Yeah.
Well, I'm so happy this movie is out and available to everyone right now. Everyone, thank you for watching tonight. Please spread the word about Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which is available on all major platforms for rent, and definitely encourage your friends to see this just remarkable, wonderful American independent film. Eliza, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Stay safe.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Okay.